Hey everyone, welcome to my introductory Seth VT2 guide. I've tried to cover all the primary uses for VT2 that you'll see when watching high-level Seth footage this season, and my hope is that you can jump into training mode and start using VT2 for yourself as soon as you finish watching this video. Also, if you have no interest in playing Seth at all and you just want to know how to defend against this V-trigger, this video should also be helpful for you, especially the sections on block setups, V-reversals and V-shifts, and on hit setups. Before we begin, I do want to mention that Seth VT2 has a ton of different uses, and everybody uses it just a little bit differently. For that reason, this guide is not going to cover absolutely everything about the V-trigger, just what I would consider to be the most important things to know about it. This V-trigger really is incredibly fun to lab, so don't feel like you have to take the exact same setups and combos that I do in this video. The most important thing is that you get the basic ideas down so that you know what to look for when you start practicing it for yourself. With that being said, let's jump right into the guide. Let's start with the basic functionality of V-trigger 2. When you activate the V-trigger, it sends out an orb that you can control using any directional input. I'll be using numpad notation to describe these inputs, so if you're unfamiliar with this notation, it might be a good idea to familiarize yourself with it before watching this video. I have a guide on how it works in the description, but if you have a keyboard sitting in front of you, you can also just look at the numpad there to see what directions I'm talking about. If you really can't stand numpad notation for some reason, you can instead just look at my inputs on the left side of the screen to see what I'm doing. The orb moves in exactly the way you would expect. Pressing forward makes it move forward, pressing down back makes it move down and back, etc. You get 4 of these movements right after activating the V-trigger, though the 4th movement is rarely used. That's because, as you can see, using the 4th movement causes the orb to disappear immediately. After you've used all of your normal movements, you do have one more movement available to you, which you can access by inputting any direction and heavy punch plus heavy kick, the same button you use to activate the V-trigger. This movement is basically the same as your normal ones, but being able to use it after you have moved or pressed a button makes it much more versatile. The last thing you can do with V-trigger 2 is simply blow it up by pressing heavy punch plus heavy kick without holding any direction. This can be fairly useful for certain combos. It's also +8 on block, so it can be used for pressure. However, you get a very similar, but oftentimes much more useful explosion if you simply wait and let the orb sit on screen without moving it. This explosion occurs 150 frames after the orb has been left alone, and it is a very significant buff to VT2 that Seth got in the last balance patch. You'll notice that pretty much all of the setups I show in this video involve this buff. Something important to know is that if you leave the orb alone right after it makes contact with the opponent, it'll explode much faster than normal. Okay, now let's move on to on-block setups. The first one I'm going to show takes advantage of forward heavy kick, which is an overhead, and down forward heavy kick, which is a standing low. There are many different ways to set up this mix-up, but they all lead to pretty much the same thing. I'll show you one way to do it now. As you can see, if this mix-up lands, you get a ton of damage. That one was with the standing low, but you get a similar combo if you hit them with the overhead instead. The only part you don't get is a jump in. This mix-up is pretty strong. It leads to a ton of damage if it hits, and even if they block it, you're still left plus. So you can just go for someone like a throw. The main weakness of this mix-up is that if your opponent is really ready, it is reactable. Also, it's somewhat weak to V-reversals, which I'll touch on more a bit later. Now I'm going to show you what is personally my favorite mix-up. As you can see, this one, you jump over and it switches sides and hits them cross-up. To show you just how hard this mix-up is to block, I've set the dummy to do the mix-up on me. For this one, I'm just going to sit and down back, not trying to block it at all. As you see, I just get hit. Now, if I set the dummy to delay their jump even just a little bit, watch what happens. that one stayed in front. So now, if I try to block the cross-up, I just get hit. I didn't have the dummy show the combo here, just because it's weird if they're recording, but trust me, you get a stand fierce combo just like I showed in the beginning. One interesting defensive option is to jump or backdash right before the Seth jumps over you for this mix-up. Now, you aren't going to avoid the mix-up by doing this. In fact, the entire point is that you do get hit, but you get hit airborne, which leads to significantly less damage than if you had guessed wrong on the mix-up and got hit on the ground, leading to the Seth getting a full stand fierce combo on you. As you see here, you're only taking 140 damage or a little bit more if the Seth manages to hit you higher with the heavy kick Tatsu and potentially go into EX hands. But that's pretty rare to happen unless the Seth jumped really early. Let's move on to another V-trigger mix-up, which can be extremely hard to block if you've never seen it before. Not only does it set up an empty jump low, which can catch your opponent for trying to stand block the jump in, but it also switches sides off a neutral jump. The biggest weakness of this mix-up, and the reason why I don't think it's quite as strong as the first two I showed, is because if you're really ready for it, it's actually pretty easy to block. All you gotta do is when you see them neutral jump, you switch the side you're blocking and make sure you crouch block at the very last second so that you won't get hit by a neutral jump light kick or something like that. One other thing you can do with VT2 is just go for a simple throw mix-up. That's just one example, and as you can see, it has the added benefit of after you throw them, you can use the last remaining movement on the orb in order to stay plus and throw them again or go for a shimmy. All the mix-ups I've shown so far are ones that are done mid-screen, but the ideas are pretty much the same in the corner. The only thing you've got to change is which movements you're doing in order to get the orb where you want it to be. So for example, this is a mix-up that I do very commonly in the corner. After you walk forward, the orb stays behind them, and it stays there for a really long time before it explodes. This sets up a whole bunch of mix-ups. Usually what I'll do first here is go for a throw, but even after that, the mix-up is not over. You just do another down movement, and here, you can wait till the orb explodes, do a jump over, or do an overhead, or standing low like I talked about earlier. Basically, all the mix-ups I talked about in the mid-screen section, you can all do them here. You just gotta set them up a little bit differently. Also, if you don't want to go for a throw first, you can easily just do any kind of mix-up immediately after you do these movements. There's a whole bunch of other ways to set up mix-ups in the corner, but I might make another video on those later because you can get really in-depth and there's a whole bunch of different options you can go for here. Before I move on to talk about how you can defend against these types of VT2 mix-ups, I want to talk about one other thing you can do after activating VT2 on block, which is just go for chip. Now I want you to pay attention to two things here, both how much chip damage this does and how much meter it builds. This is one of the best ways to close out a round with VT2. Two things to mention here. If they have V-reversal, or if they're going to get enough V-meter to gain a V-reversal while you're doing the chip sequence, this isn't going to really work. They're just going to V-reversal you and you're not going to be able to get the chip kill with super. The other thing to mention is that even though the medium punch DP I did in the sequence just now looks very cool, it doesn't work after some farther activations such as crouch heavy kick, and also doesn't work against certain characters with big hurt boxes. Like for example, I know it does not work against Geef. So if you're activating from farther away, or you're activating against one of those characters with a weird hurt box, you can just go for this instead, which is a little bit less chip, but most of the time it's still going to be enough to do the job. Something cool is that if you have a V-Skill 1 steal out there ready, you can get even more chip damage from these setups. This is just a very basic example that has, I think, about 10 or so chip, but with some steals you can get a lot more. It's just very character dependent. One last thing I want to show is a chip sequence you can do when you have them in the corner. Now let's move on to beating V-shifts and V-reversals. Now, all the setups I've shown so far are pretty much starting off the forward medium punch target combo, but starting with this activation actually has a pretty big weakness. If the opponent simply V-reversals as soon as the V-trigger2 activation starts, then your entire mix-up is basically deleted. As you can see, the orb is way too far behind me, so I can just totally walk out, and there's no mix-up there at all. Now, this does not mean that you can just get out of all V-trigger2 mix-ups on block by V-reversaling. It is possible to bait these V-reversals just by choosing a different activation. For example, look what happens if Seth tries to V-reversal at the exact same timing, but I activate off crouch heavy kick instead. As you can see, you do get hit by the V-reversal, but the explosion punishes them on their recovery, and you're the one that actually gets a huge combo. Fortunately, getting these kind of V-reversal baits is not simple at all, and it's highly dependent on what character you're fighting against. For example, look what happens if I try to do this same space crouch heavy kick activation against Urien that I just did on Seth. Since Urien's V-reversal goes so much farther than Seth's, he just gets out of it completely for free. To bait V-reversals like these, you have to activate from a button that will leave you even farther. A good example is crouch medium kick. However, do keep in mind that since these V-reversals push you farther, you're gonna get a slightly worse punish on them. Now, it's also important that you have a setup ready to do if they don't V-reversal after one of these far activations on block. You can't just do the same movements that you do after a forward medium punch target combo and have it work. You're going to need to change which movements you're doing in order to get the orb exactly where you want it to be. I'll show you one setup that I like to do after far activations such as crouch medium kick, stand medium kick, crouch heavy kick, and the thing I like about this one is that it works at various spacings as long as they're somewhat far away. As you can see, I went for the overhead here, but you could also go for down forward heavy kick for the low, or you could jump over and adjust your timing to either stay in front or cross up. Everyone has their own types of setups that they do here at various different spacings, and some of them have some pretty cool ideas, and others just use different movements to get pretty much the same thing, just get the orb right on top of them. I highly encourage you to look into it yourself and see what you can find. Now, as I mentioned before, the way you have to bait a V-reversal is going to change depending on what character you're fighting. Every character's V-reversal is just a little bit different, and you're going to have to account for that whenever you're going for a VT2 mix-up on block. Now, it would take way too long for me to cover every single character's V-reversal, and maybe I would do that in a future video, but not in this introductory guide. So I want to at least go over just the basic types of V-reversals that you're going to find across the cast. So I showed Seth earlier, and Seth has a pretty average V-reversal. It goes somewhat far, but not too far, so you can activate off things like crouch heavy kick. I also showed Urien, who has a very far V-reversal that are pretty annoying to bait as you have to do far activations like crouch medium kick or stand medium kick. Here's another type of V-reversal that is probably the easiest to bait. Chun-Li's V-reversal does not actually knock you down when it hits you, and this means that you can pretty much do whatever activation you want and you're going to get a punish if they try to V-reversal. The last type of V-reversal I want to talk about are V-reversals where the character doesn't actually hit you, but instead they just roll out of the way. Now, these V-reversals tend to be the hardest to punish, and the example I'm showing, Rashid, you're pretty much just not going to get a punish, and the best thing you can hope for is to chase him down with the orb and continue your pressure in some way. This is definitely not as good as getting an actual punish on the V-reversal, and if they V-reversal more than once, it can be almost impossible to get any sort of mix-up going. Now, everything I've shown so far is assuming that the opponent V-reversals as soon as the VT2 activation comes out. Now, this is often one of the best times to V-reversal, because if you V-reversal as soon as you see the activation, you're going to hit Seth before the Seth player has any time to do a movement and try to bait your V-reversal in that way. However, things get even more complicated when you do consider that your opponent can V-reversal at any time in your VT2 string. For example, watch me defend against this recording. I simply V-reversal right before the blast hits me. This will even beat them if they go for a jump over left-right mix-up. I simply avoid the blast entirely. But now, let's consider what the Seth player can do if they know I'm going to V-reversal this time and they want to bait it. Now, neutral jumping is not the only way that you can bait V reversals. It works pretty consistently, but there are a lot of other things you can do, but you have to know two things. One, when is my opponent going to V reversal? And two, how do I have to bait my opponent's character's V reversal specifically? Because like I said, every character's V reversal works differently, and while some of them are similar, you can't just expect one V reversal bait to work against every character at every timing. Something that I personally like about Seth VT2 this season is that it allows for this sort of creativity. You gotta think, what is my opponent gonna do, and what can I do to bait it? That's why I encourage everyone watching this to just go into training mode and just get comfortable moving the VT2 orb around on block. You want to be comfortable moving it anywhere you want on screen so you can bait out these type of V reversals. I will say that personally, when I bait out someone's V reversal that's done not at an immediate timing, most of the time I do that, it's not something that I've practiced or labbed out previously. I just know how the character's V reversal works, I have a good read on when my opponent's going to time it, and I just go for something that I think is going to beat it. There's also another aspect in that sometimes I don't even expect my opponent to V reversal, I just do my string normally, and it just hits their V reversal. This is especially true if the character's V reversal doesn't move them very far forward, such as Chun-Li like I showed earlier. A general rule of thumb is that if your VT2 is hitting your opponent from far away, they're probably not going to be able to V reversal. And again, I can't reiterate this enough, it depends on what type of V reversal your opponent has. But take a look at what happens if I try to V reversal this setup from far away. I just get hit and eat a full combo, even though my opponent probably was not trying to bait out a V reversal in this situation. One last thing to talk about when it comes to baiting out V reversals is you can actually even bait out V reversals during your chip setups. For example, check out this very basic setup in which I bait a V reversal and go for the chip at the same time, putting the opponent in a checkmate situation. I defended exactly as you're supposed to against a chip situation, which is I waited to see the critical art animation, and then I immediately V reversaled. But because the orb was in front of me, I still ended up getting hit. Now, I'm not going to go super in-depth in baiting V reversals for these kind of chip setups, because to be completely honest, this is pretty new, and I gotta give credit to Jian for being the first person to discover this, and also be the only person I've ever seen use this as an actual match. So, it might be something very cool to cover in a future video, but I've still gotta do a lot of labbing about these setups before I feel comfortable sharing any information that I've learned. Now let's move on to talking about V-shifts. Now, in general, V-shifts are not as strong as V reversals at defending from VT2 setups on block, but they do have some uses, because anytime a VT2 setup is not a true block string, it does give your opponent the opportunity to V-shift out. Now, all the setups I've shown so far have tried to make sure that it is a true block string and there's no opportunity for the opponent to V-shift out, but sometimes it's just impossible to make that the case. For example, immediately after you activate crouch medium kick on block, it's not actually a true block string, so your opponent can V-shift out if they're aware of this. Now, any other medium or heavy you do to activate VT2 on block is going to be a true block string as soon as the string starts, but as I said, if you activate from crouch medium kick, it's not going to be, and if you activate from any light button, they can also just V-shift out. It's also important to make sure that your string is a true block string after you activate VT2. For example, if I try to do this string but I delay my last movement too long, watch how they get out for free using V-shift. Also keep in mind that whenever you go for a left-right mix-up using a jump over, that does add a gap into your string and gives your opponent a chance to V-shift out. While you can sometimes keep your pressure going here just by landing a jump in as they're in the recovery, you're not going to have the same powerful mix-up where your opponent has to guess, and if they guess wrong, they're going to be eating tons and tons of damage. It's just going to be a normal throw or shimmy mix-up. One way to punish your opponent if you think that they're mashing V-shift during your VT2 string is to mix a low into it. Keep in mind that for V-shift, your opponent has to be standing in neutral in order to input it, so there's no way they could crouch block any low you throw in. One of the big advantages of the high-low setup using forward heavy kick and down forward heavy kick is that the entire setup is a true block string if you do it right, meaning that there's no chance that they can V-shift out, And if you go for the down forward heavy kick low, you pretty much have a V-shift bait just built into that mix-up. While V-shifts can be useful at getting out of on-block setups, they are much more useful at getting out of on-hit V-Trigger 2 setups, which I'm going to talk about right after this section. One last thing I want to talk about before I move on is a type of mindset you can develop when it comes to when you choose to activate your V-Trigger 2. As you've seen, both V-reversals and V-shifts are powerful defensive options against V-Trigger 2, but keep in mind that both of these options require that your opponent spend some of their V-gauge. This means that if you choose your spots to activate in situations where they won't have any V-meter to spend, such as when they've taken a little damage in the round so far, or after they've activated their own V-trigger, you can freely do whatever V-trigger 2 mix-up you want without having to worry about them V-reversing or V-shifting out. Another idea is that against characters with really strong 3-bar V-triggers, such as Urian, Manat, Laura, you might consider them V-reversing as a benefit, because even if you end up getting hit by the V-reversal without landing a punish, V-reversing takes an entire bar of their V-meter, meaning that they won't have their comeback factor in the form of V-trigger until much later in the round, and there's a good chance that they won't even be able to activate it at all if you play well. I hope this has given you a better understanding of how V-reversals and V-shifts work as a defensive mechanic to Seth's V-trigger 2. I think this is easily the most complex part of the V-trigger, and is also the most misunderstood, especially by people who don't actually play Seth. Also, please keep in mind that there's just so much more to lab in terms of how to bait out all these V-reversals from the huge cast that's in this game. There's so much more I could have included in this video, but most of it is highly specific, and I didn't want to make this a 2-hour guide just on baiting V-reversals. And there's also still so much more that I have to lab in terms of learning how to bait out V-reversals in different situations or baiting out different characters' V-reversals. It's just a very interesting and, like I said, very complex part about V-trigger 2. Now let's talk about some V-trigger 2 mix-ups you can do on hit. A type of mix-up you might have seen a lot last season looks a little something like this. The idea is to get the orb directly on top of them so you can jump over and get a pretty ambiguous left-right mix-up. However, this season, this mix-up has a pretty big weakness. As you can see, if your opponent just V-shifts out, they get out of the mix-up pretty much for free. The situation's a little bit better in the corner, as you can punish your opponent for trying to V-break out. However, this is a pretty small punish, especially when you consider that you have to spend your entire V-trigger just to get this. For these reasons, I generally try to avoid activating V-trigger 2 on hit to get a mix-up. However, there are still some pretty interesting ideas you can go for. For example, in the corner, take a look at this setup. As you can see, the orb is left in front of them, but not directly on top of the opponent. So, this means that they can't V-shift out, and you still get a pretty strong mix-up here. Not only can you cross up with this setup, but you can also stay in front just by doing the medium kick axe kick later in your jump arc. Your options are a lot more limited mid-screen, but there are still some setups you can go for. Just keep in mind that almost always you're going to have to factor in the fact that they can do a quick rise or a back rise, and you're going to have to adjust your setup accordingly. For example, let me show you this setup. Here, they did quick rise and I went for a throw or shimmy mix-up because my movement left me at +2. However, look what happens if they decide to go for a back rise. Here, they went for a back rise, which actually left me at an even better situation because I was so plus that I could dash up and go for a high-low. There is of course a third option in that they might choose to do no recovery at all, but you can just go for a throw or shimmy mix-up like you would if they went for a quick rise here. It's just a little bit different. There is one more thing I want to mention before we move on, which is keep in mind what I said when I was talking about V reversals and V shifts in the previous section. If they do not have any V meter at all of the setups I showed you with a jump over left right are perfectly viable because they will have no V shift to get out of that setup. So even though they are pretty situational, it might be worth learning those types of setups regardless for the rare situations where you can actually go for them without having to worry about a V shift. The last thing I want to talk about is some combos you can do with VT 2 on hit. Now, this is oftentimes not the way you want to use VT 2, as its main purpose is to get all the mix-ups I've been showing. However, sometimes the combo is exactly what you need to close out the round, so it's worth learning some basic optimal combos. Here's one that you can do off of pretty much any grounded activation or the forward medium punch tower combo. Now this can be optimized a little bit more, but it's a very difficult combo to execute. If you want a similar but easier version of the combo I just showed, there's also this one. This can be pretty good if you want to go into a super or something, just to end the round. In my opinion, one of the best things about VT 2 is how easily it lets you switch sides. That's why I think learning side switch combos like these is one of the most important combos you can learn. If you activate from a normal that leaves your opponent grounded, then you have the opportunity to get some different combos that lead to a lot more damage than a couple of ones I just showed, but are also usually a lot harder and a lot more dependent on what spacing you activate from. For example, I'm going to show you a combo that you can do if you activate from really close up, but this combo only works from that range. This is probably the hardest combo I'm going to show in this video, just because of that crouch light punch you saw at the end of the orb string. If you do that crouch light punch just a little bit later than what I showed, then it's not going to combo at all. And if you do it a little bit earlier than what I showed, then what you're going to have happen is instead of getting a crouch light punch to come out, you're going to have a down movement with your orb, and you're just going to get no combo at all. Now I'm going to show you a combo you can do from a little bit farther away. This one has a similar problem as the last combo, in that if you input the forward medium punch too quickly, then you're going to get a down motion instead of a forward medium punch, and it's going to ruin your combo. But this one has a little bit less strict timing, and if the opponent is standing, you can actually go for a stand medium kick instead of a forward medium punch, which I'm going to show in the next combo here, which is quite similar to the one I just showed. The combo I'm about to show actually works at a lot of different ranges as long as you time it correctly, but it's a little bit finicky and it can do a little bit less damage due to scaling, so I don't really recommend doing it unless you're activating from really far away and it's your only option. All these combos have a similar issue in that they tend to drop if your spacing is just a tiny bit off, so if you don't need the extra damage to finish the round, I would highly suggest just doing one of the first few juggle combos I showed instead of going for one of these more optimal combos. Also note that all the juggle combos I showed, even though I showed myself doing them after a forward medium punch turret combo, they work off of basically any ground activation you're going to do. One of the big advantages with the grounded combos is that they all work in the corner, whereas the juggle combos, they all drop. And especially the movement I showed where you just do back and then forward, that works off of almost any ground activation you do at various ranges in the corner. And even though you are sometimes leaving some damage on the table by not going for a more optimal route that would work at specific spacing in the corner, I would suggest, especially if you're just starting out with VT 2, when you land a hit in the corner with VT 2 and you just want to get that extra damage, just go for something like this. This combo will always work as long as the first movement actually hits, which can sometimes not happen if you activate from really far away. But if you're activating from closer and you feel like it's not the right range to get this combo, all you have to do is adjust the timing of when you input forward. I should mention that I have not explored the combo potential of V-Trigger 2 nearly as much as I've explored the rest of the V-Trigger. And this is mostly because, as I mentioned before, I don't think this is normally the best way to spend your V-Trigger, and unless you're going to kill with this combo or you're in the corner and you want to use it to switch sides, I would normally just save your V-Trigger so that you can get one of the deadly mix-ups I've shown before. But if you are someone who has explored these combos a bit more than I have, and you know some more optimal combos for the certain situations I showed in this video, please leave a comment and I might make a follow-up video just showing off the combo potential of V-Trigger 2 in more depth. With that being said, I do have some pretty cool combos using different V-Skill 1 steals from various characters, and I didn't want to make that just a big section on this video because I feel like it's a little bit too character specific, but I will show a couple of my favorites just as I close out this video. I hope this guide is giving you a better understanding of how Seth V-Trigger 2 works and what kind of mix-ups it can lead to. As I mentioned at the start of this video, this guide really only scratches the surface of all there is to learn about Seth V-Trigger 2, and I could probably make a whole separate set of videos just focusing on any one of the sections I covered in this guide. If you'd like to see me elaborate on any of the stuff I talked about here, be sure to leave a comment and I might make a follow-up video going into more depth about specific situations or setups involving V-Trigger 2. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to drop a like and subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you guys in the next one.